Okay, so we're going to look at another theme, and the theme is snakes, and it's an exciting one. So we probably all have our own uh, idea of snakes. Usually people are creeped out of them, maybe think they're cool. They're pretty majestic animals. The Bible has its own culture, because depending on your culture, your understanding of snakes may be different. But the Bible has a very interesting one, so let's look at it. The first mention of snakes, Genesis 1:26, and not directly, but in God creating the animals, of course the snake is included, and it almost hints at it as it says the creepy things, or depending on your translation. In Genesis 1:26, God creates snakes. So there's one other thing. Man is ruling over snakes. So you get in Genesis 1:27 that man has dominion. He's made in the image of God, that he has rule over the snakes. And so the idea here, just in the first couple chapters, is that God has created snakes and he's put man over them. And that's the way they're supposed to be. Man is supposed to listen to God and then rule rightly over creation and the snakes specifically. So we zoom forward a chapter, and how does that work out? And so we read, humans listen to this wise serpent, this crafty serpent. Specifically wise, crafty is not a negative word really. And you hear later that the thrust of this passage is wisdom, as Eve, she is, when she looks at the tree, she says it's good for wisdom. Again, so it's repeated repetition there. So what's cool is what happens is a complete flip-flop of Genesis 1:26-27, as now humans, instead of listening to God and ruling over the serpent almost has a wise man effect, as the humans are listening to the serpent. And things are flip-flop. Creation is put up on a pedestal and listened to, and humans are begin to be ruled by it. And what happens is death. And so we have death by serpent. And that's not the only time we have death by serpent in the Bible. So we're going to skip a few examples for time reasons, because no one wants to watch a super long video. So we go to Numbers 21, and we have another death by serpent. And we have a bunch of serpents this time. And again, humans not trusting God. They wanted to go back to Egypt. And so God, the snakes came, and the seraphs came, and they were killed. And so really the idea we have here is things that are created, specifically snakes is our example, when they're put up as ultimate, then death really happens, because that's not how they're supposed to be. God's supposed to be ultimate, right? And we are supposed to rule over the created things. They're good. Snakes are good, because God says they're good right from the beginning. Yet when we put them too high, they become not so good, right? Okay, so one more example of this. Actually, I'll give you two more. So just in a general sense, we do this all the time. So when we place something higher than it should be, something created, such as, well, you've heard making your idols maybe, or having other gods. But like sex, when you exalt it to the ultimate, when you decide to use it your own way, then things really mess up. Death to your relationships, socially and emotionally, etc. And as well as another example I have is biblical. If we go to Deuteronomy 32:33, this is talking about Israel's enemies, and it says when the enemies exalt wine, what happens is, rather than being a blessing, which it was for the Jewish people, like if you read in Proverbs or Isaiah, it says that the heavens, the future heavenly dwelling will be flowing with wine, or the vats will be brimming over. But now, with the enemies exalting wine as ultimate and getting drunk, etc., rather than being a blessing, it's said that the wine will turn into like viper's venom and kill them. And so so when you exalt something higher than it's supposed to be, it becomes death. Okay, so we're going to go one more to Numbers 21 again, actually. And what we find, and this is neat, is that the way to fix it is putting a snake up on a pole. Okay? And actually what ends up happening to that pole is the same thing that happens to the snakes before, is that if you go to 2 Kings 18:4, the bronze serpent gets exalted again, just like the snake did earlier. But originally, it was there so that people would look at it and trust God again, and that's the idea. Trusting God or trusting creation. Exalting God or exalting creation. And so I want to just point out one quick thing. We might do a different theme video on it. But if you notice, there was a snake around a tree of life in Genesis 1, and now we have a new staff, which actually budded, if that helps bring the picture around. And you have a snake wrapped around this tree or the staff, right? So just a picture of there where life comes from, not the snake, but the staff, right? From God, ultimately. And we have one more example of that is when Jesus is put on a tree, and he's considered a snake. If you read John 3:14, right? Just as Moses lifted the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Exactly. And so Jesus compares himself to the snake being put on the tree because Jesus is taking on the worldliness and being exalted in order to beat the snake, actually. So a little twist there. You have snake on a rod, snake on the tree of life, Jesus on the cross. And okay, last thing. We skipped a passage. We skipped a lot of passages, actually. But Isaiah 6 is really neat because it kind of draws all our themes together. You've heard the seraphim coming out with the coal and touching Isaiah's lips. What's interesting is seraph is used 6 times in the Old Testament. 5 of the times it's referring to snake, and then the one to snakes, like in Numbers, it's the seraph. In Isaiah, it's used differently. We consider it seraphim, and we just use the word seraphim. But again, it's just snakes. And so, like in Egypt culture, they would have. Here's a couple of things to fill us in historically. You'd have snakes guarding the throne of a king. And there were cobras specifically, spitting cobras, like we have spitting vipers and spitting cobras today. What they can do is they can spit their venom up to 3 meters and target people's, or mainly like predators' eyes, like lions or something. And it will burn, and it can cause blindness. And so these spitting, burning snakes, like the burning ones we have in Isaiah. Another thing they had is cobras. You know how they can extend their neck, their ribs can branch out to strike fear in their opponents. Well, in Egyptian artistry as well as other ancient Near East artistry, what they would do is they exaggerate it and make it look like big wings, and so they'd be the winged fiery serpents. And that's what we have in Isaiah, is these winged fiery serpents around God's throne. And so there we go, picture complete. The idea is that these spiritual beings, which are used in metaphor of these winged fiery serpents, are not above God, they're serving God. And I think that's the whole picture here, that God is served by creation. It doesn't make any sense to exalt creation above God. So humans, they're foolish when they make created things into ultimate things, thinking they will give life, while clearly only the Creator could actually give life.